Eddie would go. That's become a popular saying in Hawaii. It even appears on bumper stickers and T-shirts periodically. It refers to the story of a handsome young man who grew up in Hawaii and learned how to ride 40-foot waves flawlessly. During the day, he would patrol the beaches to save those who ventured out too far, and no one dies ever on his watch. At the age of 32, he set on a voyage with several shipmates. It ran into trouble early on, so he volunteered to swim 12 miles through choppy waters to get help for his mates. He sets off, and he is never seen again. That's the life story of Eddie Aikau. Eddie would go. It became the phrase that watermen used to describe Eddie's unrelenting willingness to leap into deadly surf to save swimmers in trouble. Eddie would go. When I heard that story, I thought of Eric Scheffler, one of our seniors last year, who got caught with one of his best friends over spring break just last March in a riptide. He finally broke free himself, only to hear the cries of his friend coming from behind him out in the sea in the night. So he went back out there himself. He got caught again in that very same riptide. But this time he made his way to his friend. And after he calmed his friend down, they agreed together to swim for their lives. In the end, Eric made it to shore. Barely. His friend, whom we remembered here often last March, his friend never did. Eric would go. The church is full of stories of people sharing their lives, being generous with their lives, sacrificing their lives. Like Eddie, like Eric, like Damien. This morning in Rome, 11 lepers walked down the main aisle of St. Peter's Square, surrounded by 50,000 people from all over the world, for the canonization of a priest named Father Damien. As a young priest back in the mid-1800s, Damien sought to serve the most pitiful. He kept seeing members of his community being taken away and never heard from or seen again. And he knew they probably had a need for a priest where they were. And so he volunteered to go to a hellhole called Molokai. By so doing, in the words of Robert Louis Stevenson, he shut to with his own hands the doors of his own sepulcher. Molokai had become a lawless place. Immorality was everywhere. Brawling, drunkenness, robberies characterized the lives of the lepers who lived there. You see, they had given up on themselves just as the rest of the world had given up on them. When they died, their poor bodies were thrown into graves so shallow that dogs and pigs grew fat on their flesh. Leprosy was and is a hideous disease. Not only were their bodies ravaged and their faces in ruins, but their breath was fetid. They exuded this most foul odor. Listen to the words Damien wrote about his experience. Many times in fulfilling my priestly duties at the lepers' homes, I have been obliged not only to close my nostrils, but to remain outside to breathe fresh air, to counteract that bad smell. I got myself accustomed to the use of tobacco. The smell of the pipe preserved me somewhat from carrying in my clothes the obnoxious odor of our lepers. Damien's aim, Damien's whole purpose, was to restore to each leper a sense of his or her personal worth and dignity. To show the poor, battered flock the value of their lives, he encouraged the lepers to work with him, to get active and involved with him. There was no self-pity in this colony. There was no patronizing or bullying of these lepers. Rather, Damien's cheerful disposition and his desire to serve touched those lepers' hearts. He organized foot races for men and women who mostly didn't have any feet. He organized orchestras for lepers who had few fingers to play with. One witness said that when he was there, he saw two organists playing at the same time, managing 10 fingers between them. Somewhere along the way, Damien made a very difficult decision. You see, in spite of this lawlessness and this difficult situation, Damien believed in these lepers. And if he really believed in them, he knew that they were basically good people and that he had to somehow show how much he believed in them, regardless of the price. And so he made the dread decision to set aside his fear of contagion. He touched his lepers. He embraced his lepers. He dined with his lepers. He cleaned and bandaged their wounds and their sores. He placed the host in their battered mouths and put his thumb on their forehead and anointed them with the holy oil. All these actions involve touch. Touch is so necessary to really communicate care and love. One day he stood before them and he addressed them, but not with his usual you. This time the pronoun changed and it caught everyone's attention. This time he said we. We lepers. Once he had contracted the disease, he suffered a terrible isolation. He couldn't go home anymore. He couldn't visit with his own community. He couldn't have his confession heard and get absolution for his sins, which bothered him greatly. He would later say that the rejection of his own was the greatest suffering he had ever endured in his entire life. Once, his bishop came on a ship, but the laws were so strict the bishop could not leave the ship, nor could Damien board the ship. Damien just wanted to go to confession. And so he rowed his canoe out to this great ship, and he shouted across to the bishop. And the bishop told him that he couldn't come off the boat, nor could Damien come on. So Damien shouted out, "Bishop, would you hear then my confession from here?" The bishop consented. And Damien, in an exercise of humility that touched all who witnessed it, confessed his sins aloud to the bishop. As the disease advanced in his own flesh, everything he saw in those others he now saw in himself. The hideousness was now his own. He could not sleep more than an hour or two a night. It had begun to destroy him from within. When they buried what was left of his body, they buried it under this tree, which was where he slept when he first came to Malachi, because there was no rectory. It was under that same tree that he opened a letter from the bishop that simply said to him, "You may stay with the lepers as long as your devotion dictates." It was the happiest day, he said, of his life. There's a bronze statue of Damien. It stands in the U.S. Capitol. It's the figure that the people of Hawaii voted to represent them in the center of our nation. I first read the story of Damien when I was in high school. It presented me with a dilemma that would later become my vocation. Damien would go. Would I? The rich young man in the gospel tonight was only worried about himself. What do I have to do to be saved? What do I have to do to be happy? What do I have to do to make it to heaven? And Jesus' answer to him was to say, it's all about you, isn't it? It's all about your happiness and you getting to heaven. It's all about you getting saved yourself. Jesus' answer turned that question on its heels. And Jesus, instead of letting him make it about himself, made it about the neighbor and the poor who were struggling right alongside of him that he wasn't even seeing. Instead of letting him make it about worrying about himself, he said, why don't you worry about somebody else? You see? Where would the grace to do that come from? Where would we find the grace to go in the end? 32 years ago, that grace led me to the seminary. And then that same grace led me to farming communities. I was never a farmer. I was never probably on a farm my whole life. I never milked a cow. I was getting up for 4:30 a.m. Mass, which is when I go to bed now. So the farmers could milk the cows in the morning. I didn't understand the politics of farming and the issues that were theirs, but I tell you, they became mine. And then to a blue-collar parish, and then to a city parish after that. And then, after 21 years, after being in college, never did I think I'd go back. And I am. Where do we find the grace to be led like that, to go when it's our turn to go? All I can say to you is I trust with all my heart that it'll be there for you, if your eyes are open and you're listening. It might just be volunteering. It might not be so dramatic. It might just be simply volunteering or hearing a way you can help somebody who needs some help. That's all. But it's seeing the need and going there. The church is full of stories, great stories. Stories of people sharing their lives and being generous with their lives and sacrificing their lives. My friends, it falls to you and to me to become ourselves one of those stories now. One of those great stories now. Not Eddie, not Eric, not Damien, not even the rich young man, but you and me. You, by your very own first name. You. You would go, wouldn't you?